Technology is moving faster than ever, so I think the goal of the work is more important than ever. And if it's something that you are passionate about, which I would think it would be if you wandered in here and hope to get involved, we're always looking for more volunteers. We're an entirely community-driven org, so what we do is what people want us to do and literally volunteer to do. Let's see, quick little busy word. First of all, for any of you parked in the parking garage, you can speak to the front desk if you need to get your parking validated, which I strongly encourage you do. It's quite expensive if you don't. You just need to tell them the last 4 digits of the credit card you paid with to get in, and they will apply the validation. Also note you need to leave the garage by 10 p.m. or you will end up paying full price, as I found out last month, and it's quite a lot. So don't let that happen, especially if you choose. I often tell people who want to stick around, hey, let's go get a drink after the talk. If you parked in the garage, I strongly encourage you to wrap up your drink and leave before 10. So just getting all that boringness out of the way first. Yeah. And I guess because I'm also trying to kill time till our live stream gets started, I'll do a little more rambling here, which is just to give you a heads up on some things we got coming up. We're gonna, as always, we have monthly meetups, which happen the second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. They'll be happening in this room. It's a change from 2 years ago when we used to be on the 16th floor, so definitely make sure to spread the word to your friends if you tell them about us, that we're down here now, because we've had at least one person who was confused and thought we were still on the 16th floor. We'll be down in this room, second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. I'm always looking for speakers, so if you or somebody you know think you might have an engaging topic you would like to present on, anything in the realm of programming, coding, emerging technologies, AI, AR, VR, cryptocurrencies, you name it, is game, especially also the legal, societal, and human rights implications of those emerging technologies. We'd love to hear from you, especially we are interested in sourcing speakers from a wide variety of backgrounds, so especially if you know somebody from an unrepresented background at these talks, by all means please encourage them to speak. I'm always looking for speakers. We do have a speaker lined up for June. Our good friend Daniel Rossler with EFF-Austin is going to be back with us. His talks are always an engaging deep dive into really nerding out on the technical details of building open source civic innovation projects. I'd have to actually look up my email thread with him to remember exactly what I told him to present to us on, but I still encourage you not to miss it. It's a good time. We also have a few other potential things in the pipeline coming up. Our good friend Michael Garfield, who runs the awesome Future Fossils podcast, who used to live in Austin, but now lives out in New Mexico and works with the Santa Fe Institute. He's visiting Austin at the end of May, and we are going to be doing a partnership event with Michael, where me and David and a one still to be determined panelist are going to be speaking with him on Future Fossils at a live taping. We're going to be tackling a topic that is sure not to be contentious and that everybody will completely agree on, called how to handle free speech in digital spaces. So I'm sure everyone will be civil and no one will have strong opinions on this topic. But it is a vital topic that, the debates on it are not going to go away, so we need to have these hard conversations. So that's going to be Saturday, May 28th. I think I have the date right, but it's that Saturday at, I think, 6 p.m. at Guanyin Tea House, basically, probably in conjunction with their monthly community events. So, it's free to attend, but there will be a suggested $20 donation to cover the venue's costs, Michael's costs for running the podcast, and a portion of proceeds will be donated to EFF, so your money will be going to a good cause. Don't get your hopes up either, because I don't actually know if it's happening yet. There is a possibility that we will be being graced by the one and only Cory Doctorow in Austin this June. He may be at the Open JavaScript conference here in June. I am actively emailing with him. He may have an unavoidable conflict that forces him to become their virtual keynote instead of their in-person, so don't get your hopes up yet. But we will definitely, if he is here in person, we will be doing something with him both at the OpenJS conference as well as maybe having a fun drinks afterwards with him. So look forward to that. Let's see, have I killed enough time I can introduce Jose? What's my time on that stream, Shanta? How many minutes till it starts?
2.
2 minutes. Okay. Well, I think I can go ahead and give our intro to Jose because it's really his talk we need to get. So let me go ahead and introduce him here. I need to pull up his bio so I introduce him properly. I always try to give people a proper intro before they get started. So basically, first of all, I suppose also I need to get out of the way, especially since he will probably be watching as soon as the stream gets going. But this tonight's presentation, which was facilitated via our mutual friend and supporter Owen McNally, is in partnership with the National Cyberwatch Center with our liaison Casey O'Brien there. As you all might have gathered, given recent world events, cybersecurity is more important than ever. We have nation states who, in the interest of not blowing each other to smithereens in meat space, are increasingly conducting warfare in cyberspace. So it is a more urgent topic than ever, sort of motivating why we think educating people on these topics is important. So to that end, our speaker this month is Jose Alvarez. He is a DevSecOps engineer with a dedicated passion for setting up DevSecOps guardrails that increase software quality, security, operational velocity, and governance. He's currently working on his master's in artificial intelligence and machine learning from Colorado State University. So, smart cookie, I think we're in for a good time. And when he's not doing cool stuff like that, he enjoys spending time with family, traveling, cooking, and attending meetups. And I will hand it off with Shanta. Has that thing finally gone live?
Oh, should. It's 7:12.
Do you see a video of this room?
And the answer is, hold on a second.
All right. For some reason, for those who just walked in, like Owen, they timed the live stream to start at 7:12 for some reason. I don't know why. So I was killing time so we could actually get it live streamed.
Yep, it's running.
It's running. Great. Then without further ado, I turn it over to Jose.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the introduction. I've been in a little bit about myself before I get started. I've been in IT since 2001. I think that's going on 21 years plus now. And started out kind of at the bottom, literally working, doing repairs on Mac computers, soldering when people used to solder stuff to fix stuff. And, over the years kind of graduated into doing help desk, Linux admin, Windows admin, then wound up getting into performance testing for applications, then kind of morphed into a DevOps role. Then after that, I got into security, and I really got excited with security because I knew about security, but I really, wasn't that into it at first. But once I realized how much, how many different avenues and really niche areas there were, I really got excited, especially when it comes to application security. And then with DevOps, and what happened with that, and security, those two things coming together has been phenomenal in a lot of respects. And so I got, started doing that. I've been doing DevSecOps now for about 5 years now. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Was doing it before it was even really, becoming the standard. So it's been exciting, and I'm really excited to see where things go in the future. So much change has happened over the years, and that's kind of pretty much my resume right there. But getting into the talk here, DevSecOps, security as code beyond the pipeline. One of the things that I always like to tell people is, we need to look at the how, the what, the where, the when of application security and understanding what that means. And DevSecOps isn't just, an engineering position, a thing that somebody does. It's, it's more than that. It's a methodology. It's a cultural, socio-technical cultural movement, right? So, a lot of times when people think of DevSecOps, if you ask 10 different people, they'll give you 10 different, answers of what it is. And that's okay, right? Because it's an ambiguous kind of area. There's not a lot of standardization, and it's still rapidly evolving. So it's okay to have these different ideas, but I like to think that the way I view it is way more inclusive and incorporates the entire SDLC and beyond. So really, to understand DevSecOps, we've got to understand what is DevOps, right? And understanding DevOps really is about understanding what happened. Why did DevOps happen? DevOps happened because there was an evolutionary pressure, right? These pressure between the devs and the operations guys. The devs were pumping out software, throwing it over the proverbial wall, and operation guys had to get it deployed. And, I remember when I first started doing performance testing and really started getting into the, app dev space, one thing that I noticed was, we were doing releases maybe once every 6 months, and if you were doing that, you were pretty good, actually, talking 10 plus years back. Most people were doing like maybe a yearly release, right? And it was really hard because all the devs would have all these, files, and they'd send them over to ops, and they'd get them ready, and they'd try to deploy them, and it just didn't work. So they'd go back to the drawing board and go through that whole iterative process, year after year, month after month, and it was pretty painful, actually. So that pressure led to, in my opinion, DevOps, right? So we started seeing the silos get broken down because of that pressure, that evolutionary pressure in the social technical space, the cultural evolution of it. And basically, what is DevOps? It's, your methodologies, definitely looking at things as code, looking at infrastructure as code, having shared pain, shared responsibility. All these things really matter when you're doing DevOps. And really about shared ownership. Like, it's not the dev's problem, it's not the ops problem, it's everybody's problem. If the app has a bug, it's literally everyone's fault and everyone's problem. So kind of like a more blameless culture kind of evolved. And when that happened, something really interesting happened, right? All of a sudden, we started learning how to deploy software really fast, right? Went from yearly releases to bi-yearly releases to monthly releases. And I remember seeing it happen. We started using tools like Jenkins and really just Jenkins at the beginning. And, we started seeing that we started deploying software a lot faster, right? And interestingly enough, security teams just couldn't keep up, right? Because they didn't have the automation skills. They didn't understand the development life cycle. And they were just trying to run their scans, right? They're like, I'm going to run a scan. I'm going to give you a PDF with all the things you can fix. And as we all know, if you guys have done any kind of AppSec or cybersecurity or what have you, that giving somebody a PDF full of vulnerabilities they need to fix really doesn't work, right? Because devs find a way around. They circumvent the mechanisms that you're checking with, and they get around it, right? In fact, I saw in one, I'm not going to mention the name of the organization, but in one organization they had a limiter saying, hey, you couldn't push code that's has a 10%, larger file than the entire, it couldn't be 10% larger than the entire code base. And that was a security feature, right? Because we were thinking, well, if that guy gets in, he might, just put a bunch of stuff in our code and get it deployed, right? Because we're doing DevOps. Well, the developers learned real quick. All they had to do is get this one really large file approved with a bunch of commented out lines, and then they could put whatever they wanted, and that rule was basically useless, right? So devs will get around things, and the reason they will is because there's a pressure on them, right? There's all these pressures. They've got to build features. DevOps people, they've got to get the product out to the customers. So, and they're going to, right? Because it's, it's the jungle out there when you're talking about software development. So when DevOps shifts left, it creates this momentum, right? And this increased speed and agility and cost savings and time savings on creating software allowed them to create massive amounts of software at an unprecedented rate. Now, some of those fundamentals, and I think it's important to go over them, is the principles of downstream flow, principles of continuous feedback, and principles of continuous learning and experimentation. And these things still hold true in DevSecOps, but at the same time, I think the most important thing to focus on is really how it is evolving in this space where security is very important. So in the first way...
Jose, quick
yeah.
question. Are you wanting to project slides right now? Because we're not.
Yeah, sure. Are you guys not seeing them?
I'm not seeing anything on the wall, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there.
Interesting. You keep going, but I'll see if somebody
Sure.
with that.
So, yeah, the principles of downstream flow, principles of continuous feedback, and the principles of continuous learning and experimentation. And those three principles are kind of the core fundamentals in DevOps, right? And they're also some of the core fundamentals in DevSecOps. But when you talk about DevSecOps, you've got some other things that are happening as well. So basically, what we have happening is we've got all this software that's getting deployed out into production, And then you start getting all these more sophisticated attackers, right? And, you know, now we're hearing stories about, you know, script kiddies and teenagers and, you know, nation states, you know, cyber gangs, what have you. All of them are actually hitting way above their, you know, their pay grade, so to speak.
I might have just forgotten to turn it on. That might be the only issue. So let's find out. To those at home, we're trying to get you slides. It'll make for a more enjoyable experience.
Yeah, so.
I mean, feel free. Oh, there we go. It's coming in.
It's coming in.
Hooray!
Awesome.
Awesome.
Excellent. Sorry about that, y'all.
I just wasn't sure. He asked me a minute ago, and I was like, I don't know if he's meeting to put slides yet.
Yes, I am. That was my bad. I'm sorry.
All right. There we go. Awesome.
So yeah, so the first way, you know, the real concept there in the first way is you never want to pass defects downstream, right? And one of the problems with security is we were only scanning for defects, security defects, at the very end of the SDLC. So if you know the SDLC, you've got all these different phases, and then at the end you go to production, right? But right before you go to production, traditional security says we're going to scan it for vulnerabilities, right? And that was typically all they did. They just ran a vulnerability scan, which really isn't enough, but that's what they would do. And then they'd find all these vulnerabilities, and then they'd give it back to the project manager, and the product manager would go back to the devs and say, hey, we need to fix, you know, 150 different vulnerabilities before we go to production. And the project didn't go live. So that is an anti-pattern for DevOps and DevSecOps. The second way, principles of continuous feedback. Can we get fast feedback, and can we always look for ways to create faster feedback loops? Can we look for increasingly smaller failure signals, right? So what that means is, like, let's not leave security till the end. Let's get security shifted all the way left as we can. And let's do our scanning there. Let's even get into the IDEs of our developers while they're coding. But even beyond that, right? We're just talking about the stuff that DevOps does. I'm going to talk about stuff that DevOps doesn't do, that DevSecOps does do and should do. The third way, principle of continuous learning. So basically this is about taking time to experiment, taking time to really look at, you know, your systems, look at your code, look at your infrastructure, and see how you can experiment and improve. And that's part of the actual, the life cycle, the cultural, socio-technical cultural life cycle that you want to have in DevOps and DevSecOps. Some of the advantages are flexibility, resilience, automation, obviously increased visibility, and deployment delivery and frequency. So what is DevSecOps? Essentially, it's DevOps, but because of that evolutionary pressure, they created so much software, and all these vulnerabilities got thrown out in the wild, and all these hackers were just, you know, taking advantage of all these issues out there. That created a pressure on organizations to start really innovating on how they could, you know, embed security into their applications by design and by default, rather than let's sprinkle some security on our application after we've built it. And some of the core concepts of security, if y'all are into security, and I hope you are, because security is awesome.
You should be.
Absolutely should be. Because security is everybody's problem online. If you haven't been hacked, you probably just don't know you haven't been hacked, you know? That's a likely statement. So some of the core concepts of security are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And those are very core principles that we use in security to do risk management, because at its heart, security is just risk management, right? So what is security? For me, in my mindset, and a lot of the security practitioners out there that I talk to, it's a mindset. But it's more than a mindset. It's how you think, but it's also a process. It's not just a tool that you know, I'm scanning my app, we've got security. You know, I'm checking for secrets in my code, I've got security. I'm looking at dependencies and the vulnerabilities there, I've got security. No, security is a process, and it's a cultural process, because again, like I was saying earlier, if you just give the devs, the people that actually have to fix these vulnerabilities, a list of things they gotta fix, because you scanned it, right? You're doing security, I scanned it. You're just gonna hand them a list of things they need to fix. All they're gonna do is find a way to get around it. Not always, not hating on devs, but a lot of times, if you're giving them hundreds of vulnerabilities to deal with, and their product manager saying, hey, we gotta get to market, they're gonna get around it somehow, right? They're gonna tweak the code, they're gonna do something so that the rules-based engines that are scanning it no longer detect it. And I've seen it happen, and it still happens. And the reason it happens is because you don't have a relationship with the people that you're working with, and that's a cultural problem, right? So it's a social technical problem, but it's also a process. So you gotta be able to sit down with your devs, sit down with them and say, hey, let's go over these findings. Let's try to understand, are these false positives, right? They probably are, right? A lot of them, the vast majority of them probably are false positives, but maybe they aren't, right? There are gonna be some real vulnerabilities in there, but what you wanna do is have a maturity model where you don't just turn on a tool. If you want pain and you want your developers to hate you, you turn on a tool and let it rip. And just let them deal with whatever pumps out, right? If you do that, I guarantee you, you're gonna have some developers that just hate your guts. Not only that, they'll find ways around it. But what you wanna do is you wanna actually develop a plan and develop a relationship. And the way that I've seen it done and the way that I've done it is you actually create like a liaison/franchise model with all the different development teams. So you create a kind of a DevSecOps mothership, right? Where you build these guardrails, you set these standards, you create these mechanisms that they can plug into and they can adapt. Now, everybody's environments are different, so what works for me in my environment and my situations probably won't work for somebody else. But the principles and the standards and the process and the method is there, and if you can export that and start helping each of these different product teams start developing their capability to do DevSecOps, that's what you need to do. Because you can't just build a pipeline, scan the code, and say, yeah, sorry, Charlie, it doesn't work. You've got to get them to have shared ownership, and that means they got to work on that pipeline with you. They got to look at those results with you. And you got to tune those tools, right? You can't just throw something together and let it rip, because again, like I said, they're just going to hate your guts and you're not doing security, because security is in and of itself a process that you take things through with people and for people. So one of the things that's really important to understand as well when you're doing security, and especially AppSec and DevSecOps, is understanding the difference in the relationships between strategy, operations, and tactics. A lot of times people, they don't really understand that there is a relationship there, right? You're not going to have a strategy if you don't have tactics or operations. You're not going to have operations if you don't have a strategy, right? So the way that works is you have these high-level strategic goals that you want to achieve, and then you enable people, to do those things, right? And that's where you kind of get your operations. But then the people that are actually pushing the buttons, the people that are actually doing the work, they should get to decide and have a fair amount of autonomy on what tools they're actually using, because they actually understand what they're doing. So you don't want to have some top-level guy come down and say, hey, we're getting this new tool. That's the worst thing you can do. Because number one, it's probably the wrong tool. And honestly, he probably doesn't even know, how anything works. So the closer you can get down to the people that are actually putting their hands on keyboards to make the decisions about what tools you actually put into your pipeline to do DevSecOps, the better. So DevSecOps defined. Basically, we're injecting security into DevOps in a nutshell. But we're doing it as a cultural strategy, not as a technical implementation. If you just build a pipeline with security scans in it, you're not doing DevSecOps. You're just doing security theater, in my opinion. And the reason I say that is because I've seen it happen, right? Oh, well, we've got this, these scans and it didn't pass the scan, therefore we're secure, right? Well, maybe not, maybe. Well, it passed all the scans, therefore we're secure. Maybe, maybe not. If you're not going in and looking and taking those findings and tuning those tools and working with your devs on a continuous basis, you're not doing security. And you're gonna wind up getting hacked, or, I mean, you'll probably get hacked anyway, right? But you have to provide some amount of security and confidence that what you're actually deploying isn't full of defects, and that you've done your due diligence in making sure that you're providing a quality product, especially if, say, you know, the product that you're building, maybe somebody's life depends on it, right? Like for me right now, I work for the Air Force on a weapons system. What we do has a pretty big impact, right? If we get it wrong, people could get hurt, people could die. So we don't want to get it wrong. Now, we're not perfect, there's always risk, but understanding what that risk is, understanding what our attack surface looks like, can help us, you know, make those choices. And just because something has a security bug doesn't mean, you know, it can't go to production. People probably go crazy when I say that, but honestly, it's true. Because maybe it's a false positive, right? It's still a bug, we should probably fix it. But maybe we can put some mitigations around it so that, you know, the bad guys can't actually exploit that vulnerability if it's a pretty bad one. But I think the most important thing about DevSecOps is understanding that it's a social, technical, cultural movement, and that you've got to build like a mothership of how things are done, a community of practice, if you will, and export that out to all your product teams and meet with them continuously and help them develop that capability inside those little franchises that you're building in each of these product teams. And it's not easy to do, but it's definitely doable, and it takes time and it takes a lot of effort. But one thing I will say about DevSecOps as well, it's more than just DevOps in terms of where you're working. So DevOps typically works in a couple of phases of the SDLC, right? It typically works in, you know, obviously development, system test, UAT, probably not too much in production, maybe a little bit. Operations, they definitely work in production, right? But DevOps, they're all there. But when you're doing DevSecOps, you're definitely in production. But you're even in the design phase as well, right? You're even in the requirements and planning phase as well. And why do you want to be there, right? Because you want to build these guardrails so that before the developer types, you know, hits the first key on his keyboard trying to, you know, develop this app, that they've got some standards in place, you know? Hey, what kind of encryption standards are we going to use? You know, what will we allow? Because if you don't set those in advance and you don't have those relationships with the devs, they're going to just do what's easy, path of least resistance. So what does that mean? That means, well, I'm just going to go grab something from the internet, you know, change it a little bit, there's my app, push it out, right? Okay, it doesn't matter if they're using really bad encryption, doesn't matter this, it does matter, right? And it happens all the time. And the reason it happens is because, number one, there's no relationships with devs. And because we're thinking like it's DevOps. We only work at dev, system test, UAT, and maybe production. But we gotta get in, we gotta shift left for security, we gotta do threat modeling in the design phase. Do we even understand our attack surface, right? Do we understand what an attacker could do based on the way we're designing our application? It's not even about the code. It's like saying, hey, what's our blast radius if they do hack this web server? What's gonna happen if they do, you know, get onto our network, you know, or pwn the OS? What's gonna happen? And understanding and having those conversations and taking, you know, that app through that process. Go ahead. You had a question?
No.
Oh, yeah, that's your question. If y'all have questions, definitely don't hesitate to ask. I love the interaction, and I hate waiting to ask questions myself. So,
we strongly encourage discussion at these meetings.
Yeah, absolutely,
And,
absolutely.
You know, as I always say, you know, I encourage civility and fairness, but feel free to disagree with our speaker and tell them so.
Absolutely,
We
yeah.
encourage lively discussion.
I can ask a question.
Yeah, sure.
So, talking about cultural change, I like the vocabulary you're using of like expand liaison, creating this mothership, one center
Sure.
of excellence. When you're talking to this legacy enterprise, the ones that need the cultural change, They like things to be structured and proven. I prefer to avoid like having to do digital transformation engagement for this company, another for this company, another for this company.
Yeah.
Are you aware like of any standardized formats like a Jira or a Scrum that have been documented and you can just point to this company like, hey, this is the program you have to do. Whereas, oh, let's figure out what our liaison means, or let's figure out who's responsible.
You know, that's a great question, man. There's not enough standardization in this space right now. There's a lot of evolution happening. So I would say it'd be hard for us to find that. But what I can say is that, you know, I think the most important thing to focus on is the relationships. Build a relationship. Like, I'll give you an example of how I had a breakthrough with a team that was kind of like that, what you were describing. So what I had to work with the NOC, the Network Operations Center, and those guys did not want to work with the DevSecOps team. They're like, we're not having it. So I did a little recon, right? I'm a security guy. First part of the kill chain is do recon, right? So I was like, let's hack these guys. We can hack them, right? So I started doing some recon, you know, started asking questions, finding out what their pain points were, where they were struggling, talk to their boss, talk to their boss's boss. And I found out that these guys were coming in almost every weekend. And running a bunch of manual commands. I was like, dude, I got them, right? So I was like, hey man, let me take you to lunch, right? It's like, hey, I heard you guys came out on the weekend, man, that sucks. Dude, he's like, yeah, dude, pay it, man. You know, we're in almost every weekend we have to come in and do this. I was like, hey man, you know, there's this really cool tool called Jenkins. I could probably help you set it up pretty quick, and we could, you know, set up some checks and set up some monitoring and alerting, and, you know, based on how the alert comes through, you know, we probably could automate a lot of the things you guys are doing, right? So he was kind of skeptical at first. You know how they are. You know, they don't really, I don't know, man. You know, I'm gonna have to learn yet another tool, you know. I was like, look, dude, I'll get you set up real quick. It'll take 15, 20 minutes to get you set up. So I already had, you know, a Jenkins running. So I just created a quick script for him. I was like, hey, what are some of the commands you guys are running on the weekend, you know, to do whatever your network operations people do. And, you know, we got those commands in there, and we started automating. And then I was like, hey, let's do something a little more too, right? Let's get a transmogrifier in here, and let's start really looking at, you know, what's happening in the chats, start doing chat ops, and start really collaborating on how we can make things really automated for you guys. So we set up something called VictorOps, and that changed their life. Then they didn't even have to come out on the weekends. You know, they started leaving early on Friday. And he came back and was like, hey man, my wife told me to tell you thank you. I said, hey man, awesome. And then you know what I did? I waited about a week and a half. And then I was like, hey man, I really want to talk to you about maybe implementing some of these maturity models that we've been working on. What do you think? And he's like, yeah man, let's check it out. So it's about the relationship. Find a way to get into them and understand what their pain points are like, and then that gives you the leverage or the, I don't know, relationship debt, if you will, to ask them to participate in the model that you know needs to be implemented on their team. So that's what I would recommend. Go back to basics, go back to relationships. Yes, having something standardized where they're like, this is the way you do it, that'd be great. It doesn't exist that I know. If it does, you let me know, because I'd love to have that. But the way that I've seen it done, and right now there's just so much ambiguity, and like I said earlier in the beginning, I don't know if you were here when I said it, but if you ask 10 different people what DevSecOps is, you'll get 10 different answers. So there's so much ambiguity right now. Getting people to agree on what it is, or even if we should be doing it, or have engineers that they have that title, is a big argument. So I would say just focus on relationships. Go ahead.
Do you want some like semi-standardized frameworks for management, safe scale level framework?
Oh yeah, safe is good.
Or ITIL as a standard, or which one is it? We've got SDLC standards, and another one. Team topology is like touches on this in terms of role formalizations, and where teams fit, where roles fit in teams. Check those out as well.
Also, if you're using AWS, they have tons of security standards that it's security best practices, and they break it out on various components such as database, identity access management, EC2s, basically every single component they talk about best practices.
Yeah, I think in my case, my problem is that usually I'm on the vendor side and I'm talking to these companies and I have like a champion, like I talk to developers and then I understand that, but then we have to convince somebody else and I need to talk that language. So it's way too much about this organization and the resources that the platform offers. That's in white paper.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is just build a relationship, you know. If you build a relationship, you don't need to show like, hey, we should be using safe. Because, I mean, you should, right? But just telling someone, hey, here's a document, and this is how we're supposed to be doing things. If you haven't caught the fish, you can't clean the fish, right? You gotta catch the fish before you clean it, so.
Yeah, every team I've been on, they use ideas from frameworks, but nobody sticks with it. It's on bar.
Exactly, and that's part of the relationship problem. The culture isn't there. People don't, they're like, man, I got my own problems. I don't need to start doing something crazy and I don't even understand it, you know, and this guy says I gotta do all these X number of things. It's not even part of my job, right? So it's hard. It's definitely hard. So, excuse me. I would say just think of it as a process. Think of it working with your teams and building those relationships and really building that mothership and building those standards, and are you actually making their lives better? You know? If you're not making their lives better, they're gonna find a way around. They're not gonna tell you, you probably won't know, but they will, and I've seen devs do it.
Hey, Jose, by the way, from this point forward in this thing, I need to get in the habit of telling our speakers. It's hard for people watching the live stream to hear what the audience is saying. Could you repeat any question you were asked?
Yeah, so thank you. So the question that I was asked was basically, how do I, is there a kind of, some kind of predefined plan on how we can actually help implement DevSecOps, essentially? I mean, I paraphrased, but that was basically what you were saying. And I would say that there is no real standard for how it's done, at least that I know of, where it's like, this is DevSecOps, and it's just because the space is evolving. But do your best to, you know, get security into those, you know, workflows, and even beyond the pipeline, you know. And it's okay to fail, but the best thing to do is develop relationships and put people in relational debt to you by serving them. That's the only way that I've ever been able to do anything with DevSecOps, where I'm trying to export that culture into a product team. It's been the only way I've ever succeeded at doing it. So even when the boss comes down and says, you guys got to do it, they just find workarounds. So if you don't have that relationship and you can't get them to do it on your own, the pressure that they're already under, and devs are under a lot of pressure, y'all. So
I can confirm we're under pressure.
yes, there you go. Awesome.
And I mean, devs have these dumb arguments too. I mean, I was having a debate with, admittedly, a senior dev, so I'm not going to win that debate, but I was trying to explain to him why Agile and it uses Fibonacci numbers and from complexity theory, and he was like, I still hate them, so you're never going to win everything.
Right, exactly, and that's a great point, right? Don't get too, you know, pick your battles. Get what you can.
Social engineer for good, you might say.
There you go, man. Hack the team, hack the people, man. People are easy to hack, guys. In fact, in cybersecurity, they teach us humans are the easiest thing to hack. So use that to your advantage. Use your brain. You guys can figure it out. Go ahead.
Is it still bribery if it's inter-team?
Repeat the question because the audience will.
Is it still bribery if it's inter-team? So I would say, I wouldn't call it bribery. I would call it being a servant leader. That's what I would call it. Serve people. And I mean, you can't force them to give back. But typically people will want to, you know, and if they don't, well, hey, you know what? You help them and you made your organization safer, probably. Hopefully.
Everybody likes freedom as in beer.
Yeah. So some of the problems that DevSecOps solves is basically it allows, you know, the security team can't keep up, right? So we had to get creative. We had to get security inside the pipelines and even beyond the pipelines. You know, one of the things that I would say that is most important, it's at the bottom of this list here, is overcoming security entropy. And what does that mean, right? That means, you know, if you're not making your environment more secure continuously, by default, it's becoming more insecure continuously. And I think that's an important note to bring up, because if a product, even though there's no new development on it, and there hasn't been for like 6 months or years, that doesn't mean you're done with the product if it's in production, right? You got, essentially you're never done. When you do DevSecOps, if the product is in production, you're never done. Just think of it like that. So can security teams go agile? And the reason I put this slide here is because most teams, they've got their DevOps engineers. Maybe they have a DevSecOps engineer, somebody that actually knows how to do AppSec, cybersecurity, and knows DevOps technologies. They're not easy to find, y'all. Honestly, I get people trying to hire me almost every day, right? And it's pretty crazy, right? There's just a lot of competition, and a lot of people don't have those skill sets, right? They don't really care about security. Maybe they care about making apps, but they don't have the, they're not generalists, you know? They don't know a lot. They don't know a little about a lot. You know, they know a lot about one thing, or this coding language, or that, you know, Terraform stack, or what have you, right? But they're not generalists. And when you get a generalist that actually can dive deep in very many areas, definitely try to hire them, because they're hard to find. In fact, I've been trying to hire people for the Air Force, and I've gone through maybe like 5, 6 interviews of people I thought were qualified as per their resume, and honestly, they weren't, right? They had some skills, but they weren't good enough generalists. Yeah, so be a generalist. And help the security guys. So going back to what that was about, it's you can go ahead and poach people on your security team that like automation and want to do DevOps. Poach them, bring them over. Make them DevOps, DevSecOps engineers. Teach them the web technologies, teach them automation, teach them how to work with the different tools. They can teach the DevOps guys how to do security.
I have a somewhat tangential question to your
Sure.
excellent point about, you know, you're never done with security, keep things up to date. This is somewhat coming up from the dev side, but I'm sure it's a relevant pressure to all of this, which is, what do you do when you know you've got multiple libraries that are like 5, 7 versions behind? You know, you need to update them, but product managers want new features, and there is no time to update them because the code has to be refactored to work with the new libraries, and
Yep.
eventually
It's not gonna happen.
we stay stuck on a library.
Yeah, we'll be here
that's
for the
being
next
rolled
5, 6
out.
months trying to get that fixed.
Yeah, and I guess repeat my question, but yeah.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is you've got libraries, you know, that are several versions behind, and your product managers are saying features, 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 give me more features. And you're saying, hey, there's vulnerabilities here, we need to upgrade the libraries, right? And they're like, I want features. Right? So it's like, but if you upgrade those libraries, you're going to have to refactor the whole app pretty much, right? And potentially, and this is what I would tell people. Look, you want to have a fair amount of confidence that the app that you're putting out there isn't full of defects, including security defects, right? But you really got to know your app, you got to know your environments, you got to know your attack surface. Now, are there vulnerabilities? Yes, there's vulnerabilities there. We know they're there. Okay, fine.
There are always vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And even if you update those libraries, you know what's going to happen? You're
New
gonna find-
vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
They just haven't been found yet.
Exactly. So you just updated this, and they're like, okay, we're good. No, guess what? We still got these critical vulnerabilities. So what you got to do is understand that this is where the security side of thinking comes in, right? It's about risk management, right? So what do you do with risks? You can mitigate a risk, you can eliminate a risk, you can transfer a risk, you can accept a risk, right? In this case, you want to mitigate, right? So you're actually going to go look, hey, let's go look at the criticals first, right? Okay, what's the exploit path, right? How do they actually exploit this, right? Okay, they're going to have to run XYZ commands. Guess what? Let's get a tool called a RASP, a Runtime Application Self-Protection Program, running in our environment that disallows the exploit path. So the vulnerability is there, but they can't exploit it. So risk mitigation. That's what I would tell them. But put it to them like this, look, I can update the library, you can refactor stuff, you're not gonna get your stuff, right? Security team wants this, but somebody has to sign off that the risk has been mitigated and accepted, right? So you don't want that to be your decision as a dev. What you wanna do is talk to the security, the CISO, and say, hey, look, Mr. CISO, I can put some mitigating, controls into the environment here that disallow, these XYZ exploits from actually being exploited. Yes, the vulnerability is still there. Yes, we're gonna fix it. It's on our roadmap. We're gonna do it, just not right now.
And I assume in this calculus how easy/hard for a knowledgeable attacker to pull off said vulnerability is a
Right.
factor. Like if the vulnerability is an injection attack, that's a lot more serious than a side channel attack because somebody's got to be a lot more skilled to pull off a side channel
Absolutely,
attack.
and there's probably some things you can do to mitigate, right? So you're like, hey, we know that there's an injection attack here. Let's do some input sanitization at some level or some layer, right? Or what have you. There are ways to mitigate it. Or you can say, hey, look, we can't mitigate it, but what we can do is limit the blast radius, which is a mitigation in and of itself, right? We don't actually stop the attack. We just say, if it does get attacked, we put so many other protections around our other systems that it wouldn't even matter. We just throw it away and redeploy. But we're gonna monitor for that attack, and when it happens, we'll know it, and we'll just redeploy something new. So, mitigate, essentially. Risk management. Good question. So some of the automation tools we can use as DevSecOps engineers. Ansible, GitLab is quickly becoming my favorite.
That's what we use.
Awesome, I love GitLab.
I enjoy it too. It's way less painful than Jenkins.
Oh yeah, it's so much easier. At first I was like, man, I don't know what I'm doing here, and then after a while I was like, this is super easy, So lots of great tools out there. Some of the security tools that you can use, and most of these on this list are actually open source and free, or they have a version that's free. And the reason I show these, as opposed to some of the purchase tools or the ones that are only purchase tools, is because as DevSecOps engineers and security practitioners and AppSec engineers, a lot of times security doesn't actually make the company money, so they're not going to give you money to buy those nice fancy tools, right? So you want to, go out and get some tools that are open source, and they're actually pretty good. But one of my favorites to use is Maltego. And that can really help you understand your environment, right? You run Maltego against your environment, you start getting all this open source threat intelligence, and it's really amazing. And one of the things that I really want to talk about this particular tool and using it is because when you use that tool, you see what the attacker can see, essentially, right? So you treat your environments, your applications as black boxes, and then you go ahead and, you look at who are we, right? Who is this organization? Where do I work? Who's coming after me, right? That's the question you gotta ask. And what's their MO? Is there an advanced persistent threat that would come after the type of organization that I work with? I work for the Air Force, guarantee you there is. So what we do is we look at their MOs, we say, okay, APT 13, Cozy Bear, all these different APTs that are out there, all these threats. We look at what their MO is. How do they do their attacks? What's their process? What's their kill chain like? Then we start building defenses precisely to protect ourselves from these advanced adversaries. And that's something everybody should do, because I guarantee you've got advanced adversaries, even if you're just a small mom and pop shop doing software. In fact, those small mom and pop shops are the gravy, the bread and butter for the hackers. Honestly are. If I was a bad guy and I wanted to go make some money on, doing some hacking, I would definitely go after the people that have small, medium-sized businesses, because they don't have the resources, the security personnel, DevSecOps engineers, they don't have them. And they're pretty much vulnerable, very badly vulnerable. So look, you can use something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework, if you guys want to do that. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework will actually list all the APTs that we know about, and it'll show you all their attack methods, how they actually conduct business, right? And then you can start saying, well, we're, like a Shopify, okay? So XYZ APTs are coming after us, and this is how they like to attack. So let's build defenses layered defenses that mitigate the risk of getting hacked by these organizations that are quite effective. Any questions?
This is kind of tying a couple different things
Sure.
together, but I'm wondering if you have any impression on how much Microsoft is embracing the DevSecOps type culture with specific regards to the open source code they're hosting on GitHub. So they can be doing scanning, at scale that scans up, doing it really well. Do you have any impressions about how much Microsoft is embracing this kind of?
I would say that they are. From what I've seen, I haven't been using GitHub lately a lot, but I know a lot of people do, and it's kind of like the standard out there for code. I pull a lot of code from GitHub. I don't really work in GitHub. I don't, do much stuff like, pushing code in there. But I would say that it's definitely on their radar to do DevSecOps, and I think they're actually starting to do it. Just because they're automating a lot of it, from what I've heard, like I said, I'm not really using their tools. I'm using mostly GitLab right now, and that's where I've been focusing the most. But essentially, a lot of the tools that they're implementing natively inside of GitHub, they're really just copying GitLab. It has all these tools built in already, right? It just makes, scanning for these vulnerabilities by default, as soon as they're in there, it automatically knows, hey, you've got a password in your code. You've got a hard-coded, secret in your code or an IP or what have you in your code that is no bueno, and you need to take it out, right, before you move forward to production. So I would say that they do. One thing that I know that Microsoft is doing, and I just read about it the other day, is that they're spending quite a lot more money now than they used to on cybersecurity. And so I think we're going to see a lot more good things coming out of Microsoft in terms of AppSec and cybersecurity. Good question.
Really quick.
Yeah, sure.
Programs like Maltego, where they're run by foreign companies, are there problems like purchasing for like government entities,
Good question.
hospitals, things like that?
There's no problem. No problem. It's a reputable company. It's out of South Africa. You can get their free version, which is pretty damn good in and of itself. And if you take the time to work on something called machines, they have this concept of machines inside of the tool. And essentially, you can automate a bunch of different types of, recon and even attack, processes that you could do. So literally what you could do is you'd be scanning your organization, building these nice, beautiful diagrams of what, all the nodes in your org, and then you're start picking up on different information, open source intelligence that you don't even know you're transmitting as an organization. In fact, when I started using this the first time, I was working for a .com, and I found that several of our servers had been hacked. And the reason I found that is because using open source intelligence with Maltego, I found a bunch of hashes. So I was like, okay, so all these different hashes match up with these attack types, right? So I was like, hey, security guys, we got some problems here. We got to go take a look at this, right? But aside from that, it's really about understanding your own organization and really getting a feel for what do we actually have deployed. In fact, I found somebody had deployed a Team City automation tool open to the internet. Anybody could log in and run all these jobs and deploy all this stuff on our infrastructure. And somebody did. They deployed some stuff, right? And they were mining Monero or Bitcoin or something like that.
At least they were using a privacy coin.
I know, right? Yeah, so exactly. So, a lot of times we don't know what we don't know, and people make mistakes. And if you're not continuously looking for, what your attack surface really is, you're going to get pwned sooner or later. You probably already are.
Also, I'd encourage you to repeat what I'm about to say, that this is directed to Owen. I actually did a little looking. Owen, currently GitHub it's optional, but you can turn it on for both public and private repositories. Microsoft Code Scanning with the repository for security vulnerabilities. So that is a feature they are providing.
Nice. Yeah. So, again, these are a bunch of different tools. Most of them, actually all of these, let me just take a look. Yeah, all of these are free at some level. Gauntlet is another really cool one. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of attacks now are generally supply chain attacks, ransomware, that sort of thing. And so they're not getting in through your developers.
Yep.
They're getting through the dependencies the developers
Yes, they are.
chose.
Like SolarWinds here in Austin, ultimate supply chain attack.
Yeah.
SolarWinds, yeah.
So, like, is there, you talked a little bit about like culture and getting in the conversation early. Are there specific like tips or things you like to focus on when you're in that early feature development sort of phase
Yeah.
around dependencies and choosing the dependencies wisely?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So you should definitely have mechanisms set up.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So let me see if I can get this question right. I'll try to paraphrase as best I can. Essentially, what was your name?
Daniel.
Daniel is asking, you know, there's a lot of supply chains attacks that are happening, and it's pretty much on everybody's radar. And basically, you know, what can we do to have those conversations and kind of shift left on dealing with that problem, so to speak, and what can we do to resolve it without, you know, getting hacked, essentially?
Yeah, so like, the developer is gonna say, oh, there's already this library that exists, and it's just like run by some, like, it's a plugin that's, you know, randomly maintained as a hobby.
Right, it
project
could
on
be
GitHub.
maintained by some guy in Russia that
Yeah.
works for an APT, right? And that happens, right? Like Nginx used to be a Russian project, right? So NATO actually didn't allow Nginx on any of their environments because there was that threat, you know? What if one of these Russian guys wants to hack one of these NATO countries? Maybe they'll push something through that we don't catch. But to your point, understanding, you know, the answer is it depends, and I hate saying that, but it does. So it just depends on what you're actually working on. And it also depends on what resources you have, right? So when we're doing security, sometimes we get the idea that we need to protect everything all the time. And that'd be great if we could do that. Now with dependencies, there are some things we can do. You know, there's dependency scanning. You can create like a repository where you've got blessed components in there that have been scanned, they've been reviewed. Takes a lot of effort, takes time. Those tools aren't perfect. It's not a panacea. But you can see those false positives, and then you can create like a firewall where, Mr. Dev, you do not pull stuff from, you know, from the web, from GitHub. You pull stuff from our local repository. It's been scanned. We know what you're getting into here. So one tool like that is like Nexus Firewall, right? You get Nexus, you get Nexus Firewall. There's other ones out there. There's one that's just been on my mind lately because we're looking at putting Nexus Firewall in addition to some other controls we've got. And essentially what you do is you hook up your repository to all these different, you know, centralized repositories like your GitHubs, your Mavens, your .NETs, all these different places where devs are going to go out and get their stuff from. And you point them at your repository, right? And you run some scans in there, right? You do your dependency scanning, image scanning if it's Docker images. And then you create a firewall and you say, hey, look, if it doesn't meet our policy and these thresholds aren't met, for the vulnerabilities we know about, there's obviously still 0 days that we don't know about, right, that are in there. But that will help mitigate it, right? So you only allow them to pull from that blessed repository. Did that answer your question, Ken? Yep.
Yeah, and I can add 2 cents. There's also the concept of immutability when you're talking about the secure supply chain. So instead of every time you're going to choose Ansible or something that's going to download those dependencies, even if it's from a blessed repository, you can create an image and you just promote those images.
Absolutely.
Stages.
And make sure you take hashes of the images as they're moving around. Because there's been attacks where it was good here, but you had an insider threat, and they changed it, and you're not taking hashes, so you don't even know it changed. It's still got the same name, still does the same thing, but now there's an exploit in it. So make sure you're doing hashing as you're moving, as it's being promoted, so you know what you got.
About images, usually it's containers, but you can also use tools like Actor to create an image of a VM.
Absolutely.
And the second thing, last year, a group of companies created this standard called Salsa. It's like Salsa without the first A. It's like there's 4 levels of something. Like I'm the guy that likes compliance and talking to this enterprise. So this is something under development. Is Google and IBM and I think like 5 or 6 companies. They got together to define these standards of what's SaaS level 1, SaaS level 2, 3, and 4, and it talks about this supply chain. So that'll be a recommendation.
Awesome. Yeah, so there's a lot all over the place to do when you're doing DevSecOps. A lot of stuff. Some of the issues you can expect when starting to implement DevSecOps is you're going to get a lot of false positives. So set up a maturity model. Don't freak out your devs. Talk to them, build relationships. Say, look, we're going to start small, minimum number of rules. We're going to start getting some coverage going, right? Because if you just turn on one of these tools, like say a Sonar Cube that does static analysis, you find hundreds of vulnerabilities. There's going to be a lot of false positives. So you got to tune your tools. And the best way to do that is a maturity model, right? You don't overwhelm them, plus it gives you the room to continuously meet with them and build that relationship where you can both go over the rules and the findings and what have you, and start putting plans together to deal with some of these vulnerabilities. So here's a pipeline, kind of just diagram, if you will, where it's not an exhaustive list. There's a lot more stuff you likely need to do. But basically, you've got, even outside of the pipelines, you've got IDE stuff you can do. You've got threat modeling, which is definitely a must. You should be doing threat modeling. If you're not doing threat modeling, I guarantee you there are things in your environment, the way that it's designed, where if something gets hacked, the blast radius is huge. So the idea of threat modeling in the design phase is to minimize that blast radius. The assumption is always, I'm going to get hacked. So you look at all your components and you take it through a threat model. A good one to use that I've used is Stride by Microsoft. It's actually pretty good. There's also Dread, and there's a couple of other ones out there as well, but the one I've used before is Stride, and it's pretty good. And you can put all those findings in the repo too, so as it gets promoted, people can actually see what those threats and what that attack surface actually looks like and what they're protecting against. So, when you're doing continuous integration, obviously you want to do SAST. You want to do DAS, which is your dynamic scans. A lot of times DAS, you got to be careful with that one. Dynamic security scanning takes so long, it's almost impossible to put in a pipeline. And I say it's almost impossible because you just need to create a subsystem pipeline. Don't put it in the regular pipeline where my developer just wants to change the color of the app. Don't make them go through a DAS scan for that, right? Create a sub-pipeline, a subsystem that runs every night. You'll catch some stuff, you'll miss some stuff. But if you've got enough mitigations, and you've done your threat modeling, and you've got all these other controls and protections in place, you can have a fair amount of confidence that you're not deploying something, totally vulnerable out there. RASP is a good one. That's the one I was talking about earlier, to mitigate. So I've got a vulnerability, I can't fix it because the rework is just insurmountable and I got to get features, use a RASP. Good one is System Falco, where it's on Kubernetes or Docker containers. It's like a container basically. It runs like a site for a container in Kubernetes. There's IaaS, which is interactive security testing, and that's actually really cool stuff where you actually instrument your code so you can actually see what's happening from component to component. That one takes a lot of work, so you might have to have even just people that are just dedicated to really handling that and doing that. Beyond that, you've got your config, tests, cloud security, threat intelligence, always an important thing to be looking at those MITRE ATT&CK frameworks and the threat intel that's coming in so that you can adjust your defenses to meet the latest and greatest attack, attack kill chains that are out there, exploits that are out there. And then obviously continuous monitoring and red teaming, and this is, and really if you got to develop all these relationships, again, create that mothership, it's a DevSecOps mothership, export the culture to your product teams, create the liaison franchise model, start helping these teams develop that capability themselves, and you enable them, right? You give them the tools, you give them a cookie cutter pipeline, say, hey, fill in the blanks. You help them. Don't just go say, hey, go fix this stuff. And that's about it, y'all. I guess probably killed you enough with PowerPoint here long enough. So questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that you keep talking about, culture, is there a strategy that you use to encourage people people to not be embarrassed when they commit like bugs that cause security problems, or to like, you know, tell you about it, not try to keep it a secret, or like to avoid blame, or like being yelled at, or whatever. Like, how does that?
Relationships, man. It's relationships. That's the only thing that I've seen works. Because when you're dealing with the human, the wetware, nothing else that I've seen works. If you don't have a good relationship with people that you're working with, and you need them to take these security issues seriously, and you need them to, it's a trust component, right? You have to have the empathy, the trust, and you got to let them know that, hey, it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, you can do everything right, and a vulnerability is still going to show up in production. So I think we just got to get around the idea that we're making mistakes. We're trying to create something, we're trying to create a negative, which is reduce risk, right? So just remember that it's all about relationships when it comes to how do I get them to not hide it from me? How do I get them to do that? Take them out to lunch. Get to
Can you
know.
explain that, or create a negative?
Yeah, sure. So we're essentially AppSec, DevSecOps, cybersecurity, we're creating a negative. We're reducing risk. Something is becoming negative, right? We're reducing something. So a lot of times we don't get funding for that because it doesn't make money, right? So we got to get creative. And the only thing that I've seen that works is honestly build relationships, create a liaison, and start exporting the culture and empowering these teams to do what they need to do. Create that center of excellence, which is the mothership, you know, and then creating communities of practice where you allow these people in that center of excellence to go out and meet with these other teams on their own and really start helping them develop that capability. But look at it from a point of view of how can I help them and put them in my relationship, in a relational debt, so to speak, where they're going to be more receptive to allowing me to help them evolve their practices, their methodologies. So that might sound bad, but honestly, you're just trying to serve them, And I think building the relationships it's hard, right? Because a lot of times we don't even like the people we work with, right? Maybe they're jerks, maybe they're assholes, right?
Sometimes they are.
Yeah, sometimes they are. Yeah, sometimes I've got some guys that I really don't want to take flying.
And I mean, I can only analogize to as a dev, but I think it's very similar to you do not want a culture where people get blamed because they introduce bugs or regressions, because that's no good. It's not about a blame game. This is why we have code reviews. This is why we have unit tests. This is, this is why we have QA. It's like, it's not about, oh, you introduced a bug, you're a terrible coder. Everyone's going to do it.
Exactly.
You can't help but do it.
Exactly. And even if you do nothing wrong, vulnerabilities are going to emerge. So we need to get away from, having these blame games. In fact, I hate the fact that GitLab has blame in it, in the repo. I don't know if you guys seen that in GitLab. You push blame and you can see who wrote the code. I hate that they call it that, but
I've literally never used that feature once because my company doesn't run that way. I didn't even know it was in there.
It's in there. I was like, man, I need to know who wrote this code because, in the Air Force, people are always getting redeployed and bringing in new people, and sometimes I can't find out who wrote this code so I can find out what it does without having to just try to piece things together. So I go look at the blame, and I'm like, I wish I wouldn't call it that. But the point I'm trying to make is don't blame people when they make mistakes. It's not a person issue, it's a design issue. The reason they made a mistake, like for example, here in the lobby, I went over to the elevator, right? Right as I thought I needed to go to the top floor, because everyone was like, go to the top floor. I'm like, all right, I'm going to the top floor. So I go to the elevator, somebody walks out, I just walk right in, and there's no buttons. And it closes on me, and I'm like, what am I going to do here?
Yeah, that elevator is disconcerting the first time.
It is. It's a little disconcerting. So, luckily they had an open button. I opened the button. I was like, well, but I can't go anywhere. I was like, what the hell? There's no buttons in here. I didn't realize the buttons were on the outside, right? That's a design issue, right?
I've had my issues with
Now,
that.
imagine this scenario, right? I was up in DC just a while ago for a training for the job I'm at, and elevator issue. It had a P, and it had some other letter, and I was like, where's the L for lobby, right? So I just pushed P. It took me to like a garage or something, or somewhere else, I don't know. Point is, that's a design issue. That's not my fault. Somebody designed that improperly. So if people are making mistakes, it's a design issue. Think of it like that. The way your process is for dealing with them and dealing with how they work is a design issue, right? Now, if you're meeting with people regularly, you have good relationships with them, you can set milestones, you can say, hey, look, let's work on this, let's help you develop your skills and get your career, focus on their career. How can I help you get that pay raise? You know, if you're their boss, right? Yeah, go ahead, you had a question? Sure, no? No, you're talking.
Ed.
Go ahead.
I just sent this to your phone also, so you can read this, repeat it to the
Sure.
web audience. How quickly and deeply do you think cybersecurity is integrating tools for machine learning and other organizations, artificial intelligence?
I would say the big
You
boys.
repeat the
Yeah,
question?
sorry.
I know it's easy to forget, but
Yes.
we had a UT professor is watching, and she'd really like to know what the audience is asking.
Absolutely. So how quickly and deeply do you think cybersecurity is incorporating or integrating tools for machine learning and artificial intelligence? I would say the big boys are doing it at breakneck speeds, like the Microsofts, the Googles. I would say they're doing it. What I don't think that they're looking at is, in a lot of respects, I don't think they're looking at how, attackers can, so they're looking at how do we identify attacks, how do we do different things with artificial intelligence, how do we automate, response to these things. And one thing I would say is that I think the big boys are doing it, but, it's a product then for these mom and pop shops that are just trying to do stuff. And yes, I think it's good, but, nation state actors, they know that that's happening, right? I've used, all kinds of different tools. Some of them use some artificial intelligence, but for the most part, what I would say is, I think that they are using them. I don't know how well that they're integrating into the workflows for building software, right? So you've got things where, AI is helping people write software, which is awesome. But at the same time, keeping people out of the loop is good in some respects, but when it comes to more critical thinking skills, I would say that the human is probably a better integration than the machine is. That's just my personal opinion right now. I don't know if that's going to change. I imagine it will change because AI is growing really fast, right? And the capabilities are growing quite fast. So I would say as far as how well they're integrating machine learning into like cybersecurity and DevSecOps, I would say they're not doing a great job because features still matter more than security. And getting new tools in, just another tool, like if somebody tells me, hey, we got to put another tool into the workflow, and we got to respond to this findings on this tool. Now, if it does everything by itself and it's just a panacea, that's great. If I've got to go respond to yet another alert or take some other action, there's going to have to be, you're going to have to, really look at how well we're working with machines. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, but how well we're integrating, I don't know. I haven't seen a whole lot of it. We're working on it. I would say we're definitely working on it, and it is moving forward, but I wouldn't say it's where, we can say, hey, just turn on the AI and we don't got to worry about cybersecurity.
I got a good question for you. Once again, informed by my perspective as a dev. So I know more and more, a lot of companies, especially companies who maybe are like, they're bigger than some like small business, like a local restaurant, but they're not like a Microsoft. They're a startup in some phases of that. A lot of companies are increasingly relying on doing their software delivery, their app deployment, via essentially Docker containers and a cloud provider of some kind, AWS, G Cloud, Azure, etc. And I think there's a mentality, I think a lot of times that people think, well, I'm outsourcing my security concerns to this big cloud company who knows what they're doing. Is that a good attitude or a bad attitude to have?
I would say it depends.
If you could repeat the question.
So a lot of companies, let me see if I can get this right. A lot of companies are essentially outsourcing, what they used to build in-house for services like AWS and using Docker containers. Would that kind of sum up what you asked?
Yeah. And I'm asking, is this a good or bad thing from a security
And is that a good or bad thing? I would say it's probably good overall, because the less things that the DevSecOps and the devs have to worry about, the better. But knowing where that line is drawn of what I have to worry about, you know, where does my risk start and where does AWS's risk start or end? And a lot of times there's confusion, right? They're like, well, we're hybrid, you know, or we're private cloud, or we're this cloud, or we're that cloud, right? So really understanding, you know, what am I purchasing and where does my risk start? Where is my attack surface? Now, your attack surface can be very deep, even though, you know, you may not have, you know, let's say you're using a SaaS, for example, right? It's a cloud service, software as a service. You think, okay, well, we're protected. Maybe not, right? Because you could see some of these cloud providers do get hacked from time to time, right? So there's still risk there, but the more you use them, the more you transfer that risk. So if you look at it from a risk perspective, you just got to know where that risk starts and what you're responsible for. And that's not always easy to do.
And while I'm correct, it's still your responsibility to know how to use the settings in your cloud provider's panel, because I mean, I've heard fun stories about, somebody had something in AWS in a bit bucket that had encryption and authentication turned off by default, so the whole internet could download whatever's ever in that bit bucket.
Right, exactly. So yeah, the underlying operating system was just fine, or the infrastructure that was under that was just fine. But so that's a good point.
Although I would critique AWS that off was the default setting instead of on, so it's a bit of both there.
So you bring up a good point. I think it's important to say this about security, is understanding what am I trying to protect. And really understanding what it is you want to protect. If you know that, then you don't have to focus on everything under the sun. You focus on what really matters. Now, you do want to do your basics everywhere else, but you definitely want to understand what are my crown jewels and who wants them, and build your defenses accordingly. Use the MITRE ATT&CK framework to find out who would want this kind of crown jewel, and then build those defenses accordingly, right? But also, put that into an automation life cycle where you're automatically making sure that you have those checks and balances, that things aren't going, to get deployed by some, side channel, some shadow IT, because it was just too hard to do it the blessed way.
I think that suggests a natural follow-up where I feel like certain industries, I think, know they are high-value targets. Military, critical infrastructure, politics, etc. Is there an industry that is actually a high-value target that you find does not realize they are a high-value target? And so they're especially vulnerable to not having as much security as they should? Yeah,
I would say that small and medium-sized businesses, they're easy. It's bread and butter for hackers. And here's the thing, right? If I'm a hacker, I'm not going to necessarily go after the big fish. I'm going to go after the small fish and use that to pivot to the big fish, right?
Especially if you're new and trying to learn how to hack.
Right, because
only an idiot would try to hack Microsoft just their first hack.
Exactly. It's like a supply chain attack, kind of like you was talking about earlier, right? And when you were talking about SolarWinds, right? I don't have to hack Google. I don't have to hack Microsoft. If I hack SolarWinds, I get into everybody. So, for example, I don't have to hack the White House gift shop. I hack Shopify that hosts them, right? And then I get in. So, a lot of times people don't realize that, they're targets, right? Like my little mom and pop website on Shopify that I designed myself because they let me, right? So I think people just don't understand that you need to look at what am I trying to protect and really understand that. Codify it, get it down. This is what my crown jewels are, and then build defenses around that and automate around that and build a culture that is blameless and definitely allows people to make mistakes, but at the same time, if people are making a lot of mistakes, it's not their fault. It's the system's fault. It's the way that you're working. It's your workflow. It's that fault. If I get into the elevator and I push the wrong button thinking I'm going to the lobby and it takes me some other place, it's not my fault. I'm just a stupid human. They should have known that.
It's so funny you just mentioned the elevator, because on one of our social channels, I just got a comment saying, someone tell the speaker, the ground exit for button in elevators always has a star on it.
You see? They should definitely put that in bold print.
Now they tell us.
I know, right?
It's on the service elevator.
Good to know. But the point I'm
I had to say that, because I
the
was
point
like,
I'm trying to make
wow.
is that it's a design issue, guys. And when you're working with people, think of it as a design issue. If this developer's making a lot of mistakes and it's always this guy, it's a design issue. Just think of it like that. Don't make it personal.
Are external or crowdsourcing ways of doing like security stuff like bug bounties or responsible disclosure, that sort of thing, is that within the realm of
Absolutely.
DevSecOps, or is that
Absolutely.
some other?
No, absolutely. So think of DevSecOps as a way to do a methodology. Think of it like that. You can apply it almost anywhere. Something like a bug bounty, that's a tool, that's an arrow in your quiver that you can pull out and use when you're ready, right? Just think about it as another tool. So there's a lot of tools you're going to have to put into and automate and get those feedback and have those, vulnerability management programs. So that would be part of a vulnerability management program, right? So you want to have that, right? But at the same time, how does that apply into DevSecOps? Think of it, I can use DevSecOps to do my vulnerability management program. I can use that to deploy, fixes for these new bugs that get found by the community. So there's, to answer your question, I would say, yes, you can definitely, that would definitely be part of DevSecOps. Because DevSecOps is a social, technical, cultural movement and a methodology. And it's not necessarily just a pipeline, a tool that I'm running. You plug tools into this methodology. You plug processes into it. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Especially, yeah, you could, I was about to even just say, especially questions from people we haven't heard from yet. We've not heard from you yet.
Kind of a follow-up to Kevin's question that's really for anybody in the room or comment.
Sure.
So it's one thing to say that you're going to ship your stuff in a Docker image, but I mean, it's like any other dependency where you can get something that has a minimum, Linux built, and then you control everything that goes in there, or you can say, hey, here's this thing that has all kinds of stuff that I was going to put in there anyway, and it's already there. There's an image I can just pick up with, machine learning code and image processing and robotics. It's everything I need.
Yeah, perfect.
And who knows what else, right? So
Right.
I don't know when you succumb to that temptation of if there are
Yeah.
tools to scan it.
That's a great question.
Trust.
Great question.
Can we repeat it?
Are there
Yeah,
best
yeah,
practices?
and please forgive me if I butcher this, repeating this question. Essentially, the question is, why would I go with like a slimmed down blessed image that I'm gonna add in everything back into it that you just took out and made me get, right? Essentially, there's a blessed image, I can get that, a developer can get that, and then I'm gonna stack all the stuff that I need in it, or I could just go get what I need. Essentially, is that pretty accurate?
There just are sort of bundled up things that have
Right.
a lot of what you need for some application.
Absolutely.
But what's the trust factor to some point?
So what's the trust factor or the risk factor, I would say, is it's pretty high, because if you're pulling things in that you need, now where are you getting those things, right? So if you need those things, all those things should come into a repository where they're all scanned before you build those images, because it's just too easy for a bad actor to say, hey, I know that, I'm sorry, what was your name? Dave. Dave? I know that Dave, I know that he's working on this really cool project, and I know it's gonna have a really big impact if I can get in there, right? So I'm gonna put maybe like a nice backdoor into some of these packages that he's gonna really not even know about, because he's just pulling it in. So they could put a root access kit inside some of the things that you're just going out and grabbing. So the way that you should do that to minimize the risk, again, Dave, even if you do this, there's still risk, and you can still get hacked, and you probably will at some point. But you want to reduce that risk, and obviously what you can do is set up a repository where you're scanning so this repository will connect to all the nice places you like to go grab stuff, right? So it can bring that in and it can scan it and says, hey, in this layer of this image and that layer of this image, I've got XYZ vulnerabilities. Well, okay, that doesn't mean it's a no-go, right? Because we can, number one, mitigate, right? We can say, hey, let's put a runtime application self-protection program as a sidecar container that's gonna run right next to this not so nice container, right? And we know it's got these vulnerabilities in it because we scanned it, but Dave really needs to use this and there is a use case for it and it is compelling and we need to get it into production. So we can mitigate the risk by using a RAS technology to basically, we look at how the exploit path would happen for the said vulnerabilities that we've detected in that image, and then we basically disallow them by blocking the exploit path, if it's possible. It's not always possible, right? But a lot of times, even vulnerabilities you find, it's like very relational in terms of the environment. You know, like in your environment, you would have had to have, you know, some, you know, niche technology deployed in order for them to actually exploit that. So if you make the argument saying, hey, I don't want to have to go and, you know, get a base image and then put all this stuff back on that I can just go grab, I would say go grab the one you want, get it inside the repository, scan it, know what's in there, and if there are some critical vulnerabilities or high severity vulnerabilities, and you're like saying, look, if I can't use this, you know, because even if you give me the clean image, I'm still going to go grab that other stuff that has those vulnerabilities. It's going to wind up back in there, right? The thing to do is definitely use a RASP at that point, and then get buy off by the organization that you're with and say, hey, look, I've got a RASP. We know that this vulnerability, this CVE, you know, this is the exploit path. This is the commands that they'll run to actually exploit this vulnerability. But we've got this mitigating tool here that will disallow them from doing that. So that's what I would recommend, is definitely pull stuff into a repository, set up a firewall, scan this stuff in the repository, and pull from the repository.
Can I ask for clarification on that?
Yeah, sure.
So you're saying that if you have, say, a Python project, a requirements.txt file, or a Node project, you have a package at JSON.
Sure.
If those packages are explicitly versioned in there, you're saying that going out and having your build process go out and grab those from the internet is still a security vulnerability.
Oh,
if
yeah.
You don't want to.
Yeah, definitely.
So
It's a security risk.
So
There may be vulnerabilities, there may not be, but it's definitely a risk. So you don't know what you don't know, right? So what you want to do is you want to point those, whatever you need, you point it at your repository. You use that repository with like some kind of scanning engine to scan the repository. You set up policies saying, hey, this is our risk threshold, this is our risk tolerance. Anything with like a critical severity vulnerability is a no-go, right? So I can't pull that, but what if I need it, right? Then you say, okay, then we go into mitigation, risk mitigation.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is if PIP goes out and gets something from the internet, you're
Well,
saying if it goes and gets it again a second time, even with the same package version, it's possible.
It's absolutely possible, yeah, it's absolutely possible. That's
How
why,
much does checking?
that's why hashes are good.
I was gonna say, how much is checking the checksum hash for authenticity?
Check the digest, make sure you've got parity there, because that happens all the time, right? Like, oh, in this environment I had this, then I went to staging and now I've got something else and you don't even know. Good questions though, very good questions. Go
I
ahead.
realize this is code focused, but do you also consider human protocol behavioral stuff in IRL, like air gaps, Faraday cages, not holding elevator doors open, that sort of thing?
Faraday cages in terms of risk?
Yeah, do you, I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
absolutely. Faraday cages work for, wireless stuff. So yeah, absolutely. If you've got an air-gapped environment, you're saying, I can't, have that happening because the risk is too high. Like say we work in the Air Force, we've got air-gapped environments, right? Like we want to get on this, what they call the high side, right? Your secret, top secret side. You want to get on that, you want to go in there. Guess what? It's air-gapped. You're not getting in. If you want to get code in there, you're walking it in.
Sneaker net.
Exactly, you're walking it in. Which, we're trying to overcome that, right? We're trying to, but honestly, it's still definitely, it works, to a certain level, but it doesn't prevent, other kinds of attacks from happening as well. So there's always insider attack threats. So you gotta look at your threat model. What am I trying to protect? And put multiple layers of defense. When you know what's really important, that's where you protect, that's where you defend. And you gotta really take time to figure out, what am I trying to protect? Is it the data? Maybe. Is it my capability to use this app? Probably, what is it, where is it, and what is my attack surface, and what am I doing about it, and who wants it, right? And what are their methodologies? What's their kill chain look like? Find out, like, hey, if it's Cozy Bear, I know they like to do this, If it's Ferocious Kitten, I know they like to do, this kind of attack. And build your defenses accordingly. Know your enemy and know yourself. Some through rain or something like that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, great questions. Who else? Any other questions?
It's fine if we're running out, but if we have any more, especially from anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask something yet.
I'm wondering if it's possible for the OS providers, Microsoft, Apple, to look at behavior on that side so that they can identify risky behavior of applications that are running. I know that that's
Like anomaly detection, kind of
Yeah.
AI, you're talking about AI stuff.
basically, yeah, that would be AI.
So setting like a baseline, say this is my normal, and then if there's any standard deviations beyond whatever, then that's bad.
Is there any kind of behavioral thing that threat?
Like heuristics, you're talking about more like heuristics kind of stuff?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. I mean,
Do you know if they're doing that?
I'm pretty sure, yeah, they do that, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm
The
surprised, in part, I work for a small MSP.
But it's not like easy to do either,
Right.
right? Because you gotta have experts that actually know how to tune these systems, how to work with these systems, how to like, okay, if we're gonna set up a baseline, do we really know that's our real baseline?
Yeah.
And how do we know that? And then there's all these false positives, or is it too chatty? So you're gonna have some experts, some really sharp people get in there, and you're working with AI, you're working with data science, all these failure signals and standard deviations, and what's an outlier and what's not. All that shit,
So-
excuse my language, it's a lot of stuff. And you're
Yeah,
gonna
so-
have to have experts that aren't probably doing anything else except that.
Right, so you can't rely on them to stop everything. But the
No,
question,
absolutely.
so the question is there anything that they can do to kind of, like, I work for a small MSP, one of the things that I noticed, people hack into a system, a little bit of social engineering, they insert something into Outlook, the script to forward something, and delete things so you can't see it. Insert a rule, and now they're sending out the documentation saying, hey, here's an invoice you didn't pay, here's our new bank account, and the person never knows it. That happens all the time. Now, Microsoft should know that kind of behavior should flag a signal to somebody. Hey, did you know that you're automatically routing replies back to this address to some little thing over here, and you've all of a sudden got an increase of traffic going out and replying something that's getting, I mean, it's a kind of a thing that you can't rely on it, but if you could throw a flag and say, boom, something's going on, somebody needs to look at this. And
Yeah, it's anomalous behavior. It's not the normal pattern. And yeah, AI can do that. Even, you could probably do it with like a Splunk too as well. I've used Splunk for stuff like that where you set like, hey, anything, any kind of event data that exceeds this threshold, you can look at error rates, you can look at all kinds of different rates, and look at standard deviations and say, hey, if there's an outlier, tell me about it. It might not be anything, but it could be something.
Right.
Yeah, so it can be done. Again, if you're using, something like, these nice, really expensive tools, obviously it's going to take a lot of expertise.
And I think that's one of the benefits of going to the cloud. So when we're talking about the shared responsibility model, like that's the kind of threat that if you're delegating to a cloud provider, that they can help. For example, Google has Google Workspaces, Microsoft has Office 360. They have like scans for email, right? Things like that. And for AI, they're going to have premium features like for network scanning, detecting patterns, and things like that. It's not like the open source, but
Yeah, I think the promise of AI is huge, honestly. But I think there's just a lot of expertise needed to really work with that kind of tooling. But good questions. Anybody else?
I got one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Given how much more advanced every one of these threats seem to be getting every day, do you think the open internet can continue to exist as it is, or is it going to become segmented on a nationwide basis?
Okay.
That's a very heavy question. Thanks for asking that. Could you repeat that?
Let me see if I can.
Okay.
So, given that threats are becoming more advanced and problematic, will the internet basically remain safe and secure or usable by people without a lot of risk to themselves? Would that pretty much kind of what you said?
More globally open to everyone, rather than being segmented.
I think
Oh, I
the
see what you're saying.
rephrase, is the internet itself a security vulnerability might be the question.
Well, it's
Yeah.
the only security of the Stone Age, right?
They didn't build it with security in mind, right? Let's just put it like that.
It took us 25 years to get basic encryption on all the basic talking.
That's right. So,
That's me,
this,
the effect.
yeah, with every, I believe with any new communications technology, you're gonna have good and bad actors. I mean, just look at the printing press. I think some of the most popular books back in the Middle Ages were like How to Burn a Witch or something. So
I mean,
it's pretty dangerous
Thomas
stuff,
McCarroll was
right?
one of the earliest bestsellers.
And printing
Yes.
it's an information technology when you think about it, right?
And I mean, the historians have correctly argued the printing press probably ultimately culminated in the 30 Years' War,
There you go.
because of the process of Reformation,
Right, so if history repeats itself, we're probably looking at some massive transformation because of what's happening with the internet. And I think we're probably already seeing that,
Along those lines, are you aware of any regulation to actually impact the supply side of this, that, for example,
Regulation.
well, here's an example. So, right now we're paying, there's a tremendous amount of companies that are paying ransomware. If it was illegal in the United States to actually pay ransomware, these threat actors would go elsewhere. And there's a precedent for this where in the 1970s, U.S. companies were paying a tremendous amount of money to foreign governments for bribes. In 1979, there was a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that was put in place to make it illegal for companies to do that, and those bribes dried up overnight. The same type of thing would be instituted where it was illegal for companies to pay ransomware in the United States, they go elsewhere. And other companies instituted, a lot of ransomware would dry up, and it's not as lucrative to be hacking anymore. Right? There's all this effort going into how do we prevent it from happening from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
There's a pretty simple solution that would prevent 90% of it from a policy standpoint.
So the question is basically, would regulation work around preventing, ransomware payments? Would that work?
Yeah, you make it just like it's a criminal act to bribe a foreign company. If you're a company and you pay a ransomware, it's a criminal act. It's your
I don't
funding
know.
for foreign governments or money.
It could work. I mean, imagine they did that to a hospital, and they are, right? Somebody's gonna die.
To answer a question
So-
I was asked about what is the current legal status on paying ransomware, the answer is federal agencies do not universally prohibit companies from paying because they do not have the legal power to do so.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if, they encrypted,
Although, I see what you heard, because there is something from last year about, all right, I don't know, I'm seeing conflicting things on the internet. I mean, definitely the Treasury wants to make it illegal, it sounds like. What the current legal status is, I'm not sure. I may need to ask my friends at EFF about that.
I thought that passed, but I guess I'm wrong.
I lose track.
I mean, you make it illegal, you might shift.
The answer
Shift
is
it a little
some
bit?
types of ransomware payments are certainly almost already illegal, according to Lawfare blog, which is usually a pretty reliable source.
Yeah, I don't know, my take is you make it illegal, you might shift some of that away, but a determined hacker, these guys are skilled, right? They're going for the easy stuff. You take that away from them, where will they go and what will they do? They're not gonna stop, right? But let's say, they encrypt all the files at a hospital, nobody's getting medicine, and you don't pay it. A bunch of people die. So we're
There's other hospitals where that doesn't happen to, because for that one hospital that it happened to, you've got 100 hospitals that didn't happen to, because.
well, maybe, but what if it's like a chain of hospitals?
In,
Right?
I believe it was Germany last year, someone died on the way to another hospital after it was ransomware attack. I
Right.
believe the investigation later determined that was unrelated, but as an example, that's a possibility.
And also just speaking as a human being, you can make paying ransomware illegal, but if they ransomware my
stop it.
computer and my big term paper in college is on it, I don't care it's illegal, I'm gonna pay the ransomware,
Right.
I need to get that file.
And I can use crypto to do it, and it's pretty much, you're not gonna know it was me because there's anonymity. So
And cynically,
Can we make it illegal? That's even the right question. Can we? And should we? I don't think we should, because honestly, you know, let's say somebody, you know, is ransoming a hospital and, you know, there's a bunch of babies in there that might, you know, die or something. I don't want that on my account just because we didn't want to pay somebody, you know, some crazy person. But that's just me.
But interesting parallel to what you talked about what happened with the bribery in the 70s, I can just give the anecdote of that my grandfather worked for Bell Helicopter in the Shah's regime in Iran in the 70s, and he told my mom, oh yeah, we got to bribe everyone. It's absolutely normal. Although apparently they actually used, when my mom visited him, they used her as a mule for the bribes, and my grandfather lost his shit. He yelled at some people.
So, give me one second. So think of it like this. You're going to pay a price. What's more valuable? Your data, people's lives, or the ransom? So for me, it's just a matter of what's more valuable. My data is more valuable. People's lives are more valuable. But that's just my opinion.
if I can play devil's advocate,
We
Go ahead.
love
Yes,
that
one
here,
second, go
assuming
ahead.
it's not about reprehensible things, so
Go
please,
for it.
wait,
I'd love to.
well, it's not always that simple. Even people who do pay the ransom, frequently it takes them months to get back up and running anyways.
Absolutely.
So I understand where you're coming from. Like, if you don't pay the ransom, you know for sure you're screwing them. Whereas if you do, it's 50-50. But
Right, because so let's say you don't pay the ransom, okay? Let's say they have very sensitive information. Encrypting it isn't the worst they can do. They could release the information,
Yeah.
right?
Usually
They could
nowadays they
embarrass
steal it
people.
first and then they
Like
leak
my
it.
information, my personal health information could be in there, right? And I have nothing to do with this hospital, right? They bought my information from some other hospital,
Yeah.
right? So, I don't know, man, it's a lot of, it's
Also, I'll
it's a
just
mess.
throw out there, if you've never seen it, it's not directly about this topic, but the old Akira Kurosawa film High and Low is actually about this exact ethical dilemma. Not with this exact scenario, but this exact ethical dilemma,
Yeah,
actually. It's very good, I recommend
It's
it.
definitely a gray area, I would definitely say it is, man.
it's complicated.
Yeah, you were saying?
So, the culture questionnaire.
Sure.
So, originally I was a chemical engineer.
Oh, nice.
And like through college, every single semester, there was always like, most of the topics that you went through had some sort of like safety level first principles thinking, right? Because you're dealing with toxic chemicals and there's a big vat of it and it could explode or it could like, fall on somebody and you could turn into the Joker or whatever. So, I guess I would consider like chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, that sort of thing, like to be like, pretty mature fields of engineering where they have hundreds of years of people dying because there wasn't a valve on something and it exploded and regulations and blah, blah, blah. So the term that is commonly used is like regulations are written in blood. Right?
Absolutely.
And I feel like the software industry, like you get your degree in CS, you don't have nearly the every semester security training that you
None,
do
oftentimes
if you're a
none.
mechanical engineer or civil engineer.
Yeah,
or something like
oftentimes they have none.
that. Right, and so how is, like, it seems like you're coming in way, way too late to the culture game, right? And how does the culture of like being secure by default or thinking about dependencies and like supply chain attacks or thinking about that sort of stuff as a developer kind of from a early on training sort of phase, how far are we away from that and what is being done about that?
Actually, the
You're talking
question is, when are you gonna start doing ed dev second?
You're talking about academia, right? Like what's happening in colleges.
Just like thinking of security as a secondary thing you do later with a separate team with your mothership, as opposed to having it being just part of the original training of every developer.
Right, so training a developer, yeah. I feel like, the kinds
As
of.
for all the other engineering fields.
Right, those engineering fields are a lot more mature, and I think they're different though in a lot of ways, I was thinking about this very thing that you're talking about just the other day, and I think what sets computer science apart is that it's always changing. And it's changing so fast, academia can't keep up with it in most respects, right? Nobody's teaching DevSecOps in academia. I think one university, Irvine in California, has just started a program for DevOps. And that's, ancient history now.
And I can certainly offer as a dev that I have certainly tried to learn as much security as I can, but like when they're teaching you how to program, they really do not emphasize this stuff.
Oh, no.
You slowly learn these things on the job, basically. And also speaking as a programmer, I think training programmers is great. They should slowly learn to make fewer dumb mistakes. On the other hand, I really think a lot of the languages and tooling and frameworks need to mature such that you can't even say things in the language or security vulnerabilities. Like that was the whole idea behind Rust. It was memory save C. You literally can't write a buffer overflow attack in Rust. That was the whole point, basically. So a lot of it's about better tooling. Like, you know, my framework, my language should auto flag if I'm like using string interpolation in a dangerous way. That could be an injection attack. It shouldn't even let me write it is the real security.
I agree. Again, that goes back to what I was saying, treat it as a design problem. Security is a design problem, right? But educating people against something that's evolving and changing quite rapidly is pretty hard. Like, why don't we teach devs about security? Because doing dev stuff is hard. And now you're going to teach them something that's really hard, which is security, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get it right, even when you're doing it right. So it's just a lot. You know, it's like saying, okay, look, Mr. Doctor, you're going to medical school, but I'm going to change the body on you every other day. But you still need to keep the body safe from disease, but it's never the same. See how complicated that could be, right? For a doctor to do that. I can't even medicate him.
Bioengineer points
I
out
can't even
that
medicate
bodies
this
are
patient
changing
because
all
I don't
the
know what's
time.
going to happen. Because the body isn't the same anymore. So apps are changing, they're evolving, and it's going so fast that we're just, you know, it's a complicated problem, basically. And academia is not really designed to incorporate, you know, all these evolutionary breakthroughs that are happening in that space really quickly back into, you know, academia. You had a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so given that it's safe to say that there aren't any like major like campaigns to better institutionalize the practice, are there any like budding forums or sources of information where a lot of informed people are talking about this with each other?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a lot of communities of practice out there for DevSecOps. There's DevSecCon. I do a meetup here in Austin, DevSecOps meetup here monthly. I didn't do last month because I was in DC for a training, but I typically do it every month, once a month.
Yeah, if you like this, go check this meetup out.
Yeah, we have some really interesting conversations, you know.
Because we don't always talk about this. We'll be talking about something totally different next month.
Exactly, there you go. So yeah, there's a lot out there, but again, you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. There's a lot of opinionated, you know, ideas about DevSecOps. Some people think it shouldn't even exist. Some people think there's no such thing as a DevSecOps engineer because it's just a methodology. I would argue against both of those, you know.
There's an old rule of thumb that you shouldn't trust any code that you didn't write or review yourself. And these days...
It's hard. Yeah, because like, you know,
Yes,
kind of like what Dave was saying
I wrote
earlier.
my whole own kernel. I wrote my own instruction set architecture on the processor.
Yeah, not
Good
happening.
luck.
Yeah, it's not happening. I'm screwed. It was kind of like what Dave was saying earlier, you know, like I need all these things for a specific application, right? And what happens, you're gonna pull in all this other stuff that other people wrote. And unfortunately, with it comes risk.
And in fact, I'll just say for anybody who wants, this is actually a fundamental philosophy problem in computer science. Anybody who wants to learn more, I recommend reading a paper from the early 80s. Donald Knuth, the legendary computer programmer, wrote called On Trusting Trust, which is basically about all code may have vulnerabilities in it and there's no way around it.
It does eventually. All code has vulnerabilities eventually. I'd agree with that 100%. It's just a matter of time.
I also actually have one more question from the web here for you. Somebody asked more programming or technical processing question about DevSecOps. Where does contract language limit or expand threat services from a DevSecOps perspective?
Contract language, like legal contracts?
I think more like as in when I was a little...
Like compliance
I
contracts?
think, where was it? I looked it up a little myself because I wanted to make sure I was getting the context for you, right? Contract language in a CS context means the contract language consists of clauses, terms, line definitions, and formatting, pre-execution attachments. You can modify the language only when the contract is in the draft or negotiation status. This is how IBM defines it.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to answer the question, I'm not sure.
Okay, cool. I'm just passing it along.
Yeah, what I would say is that, you definitely, I'm a generalist, right? So the people that have expertise in specific languages and specific, niche areas, that's where that relationship comes from the DevSecOps engineering side, where we're working with them and they're being honest about, hey, we've got these, modules, we've got these things that are happening in the code, and they present certain attack surfaces and risks to the way the app works, and then you build, protections around them. But yeah, be a generalist if you're doing DevSecOps. You want to be a developer, be a specialist.
Dang, I'm a developer who tries to be a generalist.
Awesome.
Trouble.
Do DevSecOps. Man.
Do we have any final questions? Because we officially have the room for 4 more minutes. So do we have any final questions? No? Well, I want to everybody give a big round of applause. I learned a lot, and I do a lot of this for a living, and I learned so much.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. It's very nice to see these meetups continuing to grow in person again. Great to see all your faces in person. For those of you who can stick around, I usually encourage people who want to actually chat and get to know each other to grab it around. So if you want to stick around for that, I encourage you with the asterisk that if you're parked in the garage, you have to leave before 10, or you need to move your car if you want your validation to actually apply. But for those of you who want to stick around and get a drink, I encourage you to. Otherwise, we'll see you next month. That's so much fun.
Can we drink here or at the
Well, considering the new rule about it's only good till 10, we may want to get it in the lobby instead of 1.
Know the percentage of security professionals that are still around the road.
I'm sorry I didn't ask when you were coming in.
You were in operations management.
I wasn't on I really enjoyed kind of presentation, very much.
Trust me, I'm in the same boat. The only coding I know is HTML and CSS, and that's not even coding.
But I don't have really
Soak it up.
it's gonna be make a couple of things so that I can understand the priority of this. I think our company is going to be inclusive with structure, even though it's and so I feel like
This new layout idea, walking,
What I'm hearing from you is
and it's a
where do I
lot
get
of money.
started, right? As far as doing DevSecOps, thinking about DevSecOps. I would say if you're already familiar with web technologies, if you're already familiar with automation technologies, if you're not, that'd be a good place to start. If you are, then I would say focus on.
I figured this was the beta test one. If you've got nothing
That way you
to
think about security. And a good book to read is Days of Goliath.
Like, one of the things that I've heard people say,
next month, neighborhood to next month, basically.
And that book really helps me change how I think about security and how to really approach, security mindset. Because you really always have to have that mindset. You really always have to think about, what could go wrong? What am I doing to protect it? What do I do? The best question to ask for security is, what am I trying to protect? If you can answer that, then you will. But that is a hard question to ask. It's not hard to ask, it's hard to answer. Because
you bring in cigarettes,
we think we know what we're trying to protect. But if you have a security mindset and you think like a hacker, you think like a hacker, you'd be surprised
Well, all right, well,
what
we'll
actually
talk, we'll
matters.
figure out the best way. We're gonna iterate on this process to make it as painless as
Yeah, no, I
possible.
was
And of
saying,
course,
build
Only
one
when
up,
you're
right?
free to make us feel like
And then,
it.
yeah, anyway.
Are you familiar with like automation technologies?
Yeah, I'm really, but I'm still like a novice to like it by the way, like.
GitLab's a great one.
Yeah.
It's got your repo in there, you can do pipelines pretty easy.
Yeah.
We
It's
want
super
systems to be
Okay.
secure.
I think, yeah, so it'd be like probably.
I'm not
Yeah.
so much of an
My
anarchist.
expertise, and I think,
Yeah, but
you know,
we're an agile
identify
process,
with
so always iterating. I may be
doing that as a part of my work.
We've been doing this for 6 or 7 years,
Yeah, no,
iterating
you
and
said your
iterating.
principle was, continuous learning and,
absolutely important.
so what is your pace around that? Because I know that that can be.
Good question. Try it, right? I would say make it cycle every week. Like what I like to do is taking Friday afternoon and just doing that every week. Just take a few hours every week, hopefully with the team. Get people together and say, hey, look, let's do some, experimentation. Let's try to innovate. What could we innovate?
Hey, thanks, great talk, man.
Thank you, man.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, and I hope a few people check out your meetups, because seriously, it's very informative.
Actually, I will. I'm going to take off, but it was
Yeah,
really nice to meet you.
likewise.
And I just want to say thank you so much for coming to the meetup. I hope we'll see you again sometime.
Absolutely, thank you.
Are you able to stick around during this real break? Awesome. Okay, cool. I think we're all just gonna go to the bar here so that we don't. Yeah, we usually go to Firehouse because it's cool and you get to go through a bookcase. But with this whole, you gotta be out by 10 or you're gonna pay $45. I don't want to encourage people missing that window.
I got you, man.